Welcome to Mattituck Moments, buried in water. There are events which can indelibly etch themselves into a city's history and memory, and for Waterbury, the flood of '55 is certainly one of those. The story begins in a typically balmy, if otherwise unremarkable, August in 1955, as the Atlantic hurricane season was beginning to heat up. The two large storms that would become Hurricanes Connie and Diane developed in the tropics and began to circle one another in a gigantic superstorm known as the Fujiwara effect. Connie broke off this dance first and drove up the East Coast. While Connecticut narrowly missed a direct hit, the edges of the storm managed to saturate the ground with 6 inches of rain on August 12th. 5 days later, it was Diane's turn to take the stage, this time with New England squarely in the crosshairs. Heavy rainfalls pummeled Connecticut over the course of August 17th and 18th, totaling 20 inches in some spots. The deluge filled rivers and streams to their breaking point. Notable among these were the Mad, Chepaug, and Housatonic rivers, and most importantly for our story, the Naugatuck River. With the ground already saturated by Hurricane Connie, the huge volume of water flowed into the tributaries of the Naugatuck. Shortly after midnight on the 19th, the river crested just north of the city, and while Waterbury slept, the floods came. Waterburyans awoke to the surreal sight of their city streets seemingly transformed into canals by the water of the Naugatuck River overflowing its banks.
We awoke with a noise like thunder. My husband went on the porch to see what was going on. My husband noticed water reaching up to his car. He said, "Honey, I'm going to move my car so water won't get to it." I turned on the radio for news, but there was nothing. The television, the telephone, nothing was working. My father was living with us. We went back on the porch to find the water filling the street and reaching up to half of the first floors all over. It came up so fast that my husband was not able to come back home.
The damage was unlike anything seen in the city since 1902, when the Great Fire left the downtown retail area in ashes. The flood brought with it far greater financial losses and far more loss of life. As the low-lying areas of the city filled with water, the city's famous green appeared more like a lake with the Immaculate Conception Church and the Alton Hotel on its shores. In the normally bustling commercial hub of Exchange Place, police scrambled to direct traffic away from the city's west side in order to save others from the fate of this poor motorist. These views from West Main Street and Waterbury Hospital at the height of the floodwaters reveal why. A city cleaved in two by its river. At the lowest elevation in the city, the south end was especially hard hit, with many neighborhoods and businesses in the water's path. At the junction of South Main and Grand Streets, the spires of St. Anne's in the distance give a hint of the depth of the flood. The rushing waters covered the South Leonard Street Bridge, submerging cars along South Riverside Street. The Chapel of Riverside Cemetery was a lonely outpost along North Riverside Street, where the flood took its greatest toll in private home damage, with some 17 residences ripped away from their foundations. The scope of the damage can be seen in this shot of Summit Street after the river crest dropped 6 feet, with some buildings swept away entirely and others hanging precariously over the riverbank. I can remember one of the neighbors coming over to the house, knocking on the door and telling my dad there was a giant house floating in downtown Brooklyn. When the water receded, my mother and father and sister and I were walking on Lower South Leonard Street, and my mother said, "Step on that board." And when I did, she said, "That's the roof of the house that was there. Never forget that." And I never did. Waterbury's Brooklyn section, seen here at the height of the flood as firemen survey the damage of North Riverside Street, was also hammered by the flood, with extensive damage along Bank and West Liberty Streets. Railroad tracks on the train bridge twisted like ribbons of steel, the cars tossed aside by the sheer force of the water. The tenement building of Ward's Flats ripped in half, all testament to the awesome power of nature on a rampage. Amid the destruction and chaos, the city's character and its sense of community shone through, as police, firefighters, local businesses, and the public all banded together with the top priority of preserving human life. Sikorsky helicopters, loaned by the Connecticut National Guard with aid from the United States Army and Navy, flew hundreds of rescue missions and delivered food and much-needed medical supplies to citizens cut off by floodwaters. This marooned resident was rescued by cable as floodwaters surrounded his Railroad Hill Street home.
The current was coming with such force that it moved buildings off their foundations. Buildings on Congress Avenue and Riverside Street all went down one by one, banging against each other and falling apart with people in them. We could see people in windows screaming for help, but they all disappeared in the water. Helicopters were picking up people who were hanging onto trees or holding onto anything they could reach. Some workers had reached the roof of the American Brass Company. Some were drowned inside the shop.
Deputy Fire Chief Frank Moore and Battalion Chief Walter Joy direct this dramatic rescue operation of 3 stranded Waterbury firemen. Using some creative thinking, a breeches buoy, typically used for rescuing stranded people at sea, was deployed to rescue these employees of the Casertano Produce Company on Freight Street. The early morning of the flood, George Baines, a friend of my brother and who also worked at the American Electro Company, kept his small boat in my garage. He knocked on my door for the boat. He said he heard Waterville was flooded out and he wanted to save those trapped in the homes.
By now, water had reached the second floor. Soldiers in small boats were trying to rescue people from windows, but it was never our turn. My father thought of pulling off doors so we might float on them. Finally, soldiers came for us.
The floodwaters also brought with them the danger of typhoid fever. These Navy hospitalmen were among the hundreds of agencies and volunteers assisting those who were rescued or displaced from their homes. This wary young boy was the recipient of the 7,000th typhoid inoculation. In total, some 80,000 Waterbury residents were inoculated, waiting in long lines such as this one at an emergency center. With the flood having cut off city water, the Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Waterbury kept its 960-gallon-an-hour filtering plant in daily operation to provide the public with safe, clean drinking water. Cleanup crews started working as soon as the water began to recede and continued until the job was done. As an act of defiance to the forces of nature, the Waterbury Republican managed to continue printing throughout the disaster, though by necessity using presses in Bridgeport. Learning from the catastrophe of the flood of '55, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers devised a system of dams to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. Completed in 1960, the Thomaston Dam on the Naugatuck River, as well as 6 smaller dams on its tributaries, have prevented similar devastation from flooding ever since.